Hello, everybody, and welcome to Forever Sports. And a very interesting situation at the moment, which has caused a lot of debate. Will Skelton has officially departed the Wallabies squad and returned back to France to join La Rochelle for pre-season as per contractual obligations, which once again sort of raised the big question about regulating the release of international players and how the current regulations don't really suit, to be honest, the way the world order is currently happening, because there are two different regulations which govern northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere clubs. And as a result, you've got players who play in the Premiership, for example, your URCs, your even Japan, top 14 and the likes of that suddenly can potentially can't represent their nations at crucial periods because they don't fall within the regulated international windows that are pursuant to those clubs in particular. And it's raising a big question about club rugby versus international rugby, which should take preference, and kind of how you solve this issue. It's not a unique issue, to be honest. And we've seen lots of clubs be quite protective about their players, as is their right. The clubs pay the big salaries at the end of the day. It's one of the saviors, really, for the Springboks, that a lot of them get their bigger salaries from overseas sources, overseas clubs, for example, which means that they can earn what they want to earn, and we can still have them available for the Springboks. And that is one of the big reasons why a lot of the Springbok players favor Japan, because we've got a very good working relationship with the Japanese clubs. Their season ends at the right sort of time there and starts, in December. And there's usually a good agreement about being able to play outside international windows with the Japanese clubs. And as a result, it means our Springbok players are generally available for most of the tests. The only ones that sometimes aren't are your players playing in Europe, to be honest, when it comes to sort of those international tests outside of the November window or even outside the July window. I mean, technically, the players who are involved in the Premiership right now, the clubs could call it back. Like a Thomas Tutoy, for example, there's had to be communication and working with Sale Sharks to allow Thomas Tutoy to be with the Springboks at the moment. So this is quite a controversial thing. And the big thing people are saying is that Australia are in the running to win the Rugby Championship. They've got to play against Argentina twice at home. They'll back themselves. And if they get two wins, for example, and South Africa beat New Zealand, all of a sudden Australia could become major contenders for the Rugby Championship. And you've got a Will Skelton, who is arguably their most important player. Definitely went sort of top three most important players in that squad. And now Australia, for the first time in however many years, are in the running to potentially go and try and win a Rugby Championship, and he's not allowed to play. And it all comes down to Regulation 9. And we're going to go through Regulation 9, which is on the World Rugby website if you really want to get into it. But basically, Regulation 9, it says high quality international rugby is in the best interest of the sport at all levels. It promotes the sport, encourages new participants, and support for the sport around the world at all levels. International rugby is a major public interest, and it is in the best interest of the public that the best teams and players represent their unions. The retention of high quality international rugby benefits players because it fulfills their aspiration to play at the highest level of the sport. The selection of the best players for international rugby also represents the fairest selection system, as it is based on playing merit. Rugby bodies and clubs benefit if players play international rugby, as it improves the quality and experience of players, increases their value, and enhances commercial returns in respect of merchandising, broadcast, sponsorship, and gates, thereby contributing to the interests of the rugby body or club that the player represents. The development of the sport is enhanced and furthered as a result of the generation of funds from international rugby for reinvestment in the sport. That is the preamble. That is why the rule exists, and that's what the rule's trying to do, basically. And the whole thing is, the whole part of our question B is that therefore they need to be able to select these players. And but also the rule C basically says that we need to recognize that there's a right to release within reasonable expectations, in terms of you can't just willy-nilly all of a sudden just to sort of select these players whenever you want as an international team. The Boks can't just go and plan a tour for October and expect clubs to release them. And basically what they've done is the middle ground, and it's basically a set period, and there's two international windows, like set windows, And then there's Northern and Southern Hemisphere windows as well, which govern those specific competitions that they play in those kind of periods. So basically, in terms of the right to release, a union, in terms of the provisions, have the right to a player's availability for selection appearance for a national representative team or national squad of the union, including a reasonable preparation period immediately prior to matches. You're talking about training sessions and the likes of that. So we're talking about a union now. A union, rugby club, rugby or club is obliged to release a player to the union for which the player is eligible when selecting by such union for a national representative team. So basically, in the provisions of Section 9, so basically they've created windows and times where you have to release those players. You are not allowed to block them from playing. And that's the whole thing. It says they may not inhibit, prevent, discourage, desensitize, desensitize, we'll get there in the inch, or render unavailable any player from a selection, attendance, and appearance in the national representative team or national squad session with such request for selection, yada, yada. Basically, they can't stop them. They can't basically say we're going to penalize you, or if you come back, we'll give you more money, for example, and basically incentivize them from doing it. So they can't de-incentivize them. That's the big thing. They can't say, well, we'll offer you benefits, or we'll take away benefits if you don't go to international unions. However, then it comes to the when. So the when is there are designated release periods for the men's global game, which is men's hemisphere release periods, and the rugby championship release period as set out in regulation 9.7. And for women, there are different ones. So if we look at the different events, these sort of events apply to designated release events set out below. So it doesn't matter when they happen, these events, you have to release them. Union designated release events, the quadrennial Rugby World Cup tournament and qualification matches, the quadrennial Rugby World Cup Sevens event, and Olympic Sevens rugby event and qualification and matches, combined teams designated and released. The British and Irish Lions Tour is a designated event, and all players slated to participate shall be released, so you can't get them from going there. And if you look at the tour of the continental tour of the combined team of the Pacific Island Unions, features Samoa and Tonga as a designated event as well, and players shall be released. In terms of the men's game, there are two global release periods: the July window and the November window. And that basically takes care of your incoming tours, for example, your under 20 World Cups, for example, and in November you've got your Autumn Nations series. Then you've got your hemisphere release periods. Now, your Northern Hemisphere periods are basically the sort of your Six Nations times, really. And that kind of sort of governs that whole thing that from the first weekend of February each year, continue for the next 6 consecutive weekends, players shall be released prior to the Northern Hemisphere release periods. And that's also important in terms of the unions can keep them in camp and not release them back, even if it's an off weekend, for example. So you don't have to send them back to the teams even during those times where you're not necessarily playing. If you look at the Southern Hemisphere times, then, for example, you're looking at the Rugby Championship, and you can see, first weekend of August, continue for the next 8 consecutive weekends. And they should be released prior to that for camps and the likes of that. So there's all these different types of regulations which basically create this time frame. And over here, if you look at the Rugby Championship release period, it's the right to release for match style players who are eligible pursuant to Regulation 18 to Regulation H for the next national in the Rugby Championship International Tournament during the Rugby Championship release period. However, that only applies to Southern Hemisphere. And that is the issue here, is the fact that La Rochelle do not have to release Will Skelton because that does not govern them in terms of the Southern Hemisphere and Northern Hemisphere periods. And that's the biggest problem at the moment, is the fact that Will Skelton is not regulated in terms of having to release them right now. If he was playing in Australia, they'd have to release him right now. And they'd have to basically give him that opportunity to play in the Rugby Championship. La Rochelle do not have to do any such thing. And it's frustrating, but this is the continuous sort of issue we have. Now, what's going to be interesting is now when you look, for example, at like R360, the new sort of rugby concept coming in, is that that's going to be very much designed around your international windows to ensure that all these players will be able to play international rugby from an eligibility point of view and then they don't have to worry. So, for example, that's kind of the middle ground. So Will Skelton will still be able to earn big bucks and play for the Wallabies, for example, because they're going to make sure they're going to be available and they're going to kind of work around their schedule so that he can be full-time Wallabies player, still earn good money and the likes of that. So it's the continued sort of pull between club and national. And the problem is at the moment, the international game does not exist without the club game, but also the club game usually didn't exist without the international. But the problem is a place like a top 14, for example, they're backing themselves. They reckon they could exist without an international system. And that's kind of becoming almost like a Premier League football, La Liga football, for example, where they're saying internationals are actually not as relevant apart from a World Cup. Our domestic competition is actually bigger and far more lucrative and much bigger, and that's what we need to prioritize. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know down in the comments below. Smash a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Steve. I'll chat to you soon.